In today's video, I wanted to continue with and finish up my journey through the main questline featured in the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall. Last time, I worked with Queen Aetherius of Sentinel and retrieved a painting from the dungeons of Wayrest. The painting depicted a lone Daggerfall representative surrounded by a bunch of Wayrest advisors. One of the advisors ended up assassinating the man from Daggerfall. Given that this was a relic of King Lysandis and the overall setting of the painting, it was clear that the man from Daggerfall was Lysandis himself. The next quest had me working with the King of Worms again. He asked me to travel to Sentinel in order to delve into its castle's dungeons. Down here, there was a lich named Prince Carolus, the grandfather of King Cameron. Defeating the lich, storing its soul in a scarab, and returning to the King of Worms, he rewarded me with information regarding the Underking. The Underking's real identity is Xehanarctus, and he too seeks the Mantella. Now, the next quest actually had me working for the Underking. The necromancers had stolen a token from him, cursed it, and gifted it to the Blades. Due to his own personal reasons, Arctus doesn't want the Blades harmed. So, I was tasked with infiltrating Castle Lugwich, retrieving the Anticlear surcoat, and bringing it back to one of Zurin's agents. Upon doing so, the agent rewarded me with valuable information. They confirmed that Lysandis was betrayed and murdered. They also point me to his real tomb, which is in the region of Menevia. Moving on, the next quest had me working with Medora Dureni, Lysandis' mistress and former court sorceress. Fighting my way through her tower on the Isle of Balfira, I made it to her quarters and together we hatched a plan. We both want to see Lysandis' soul saved, but in order for Dureni to do more for him, she needs to be able to leave the tower. The only way she can break the curse is if she retrieves a unicorn horn. As it just so happens, there's one in Shedungeon, and Medora believes Nilfgaard will be willing to give it up for the cause. Well, it turned out that she was, and returning with it, Medora said that she'll be in touch with any possible revelations regarding the late king. The final quest had me working with Queen Baranzaya. She wanted me to fetch a piece of her biography from the depths of Orsinium. She doesn't like how she's depicted in it and says that it's all lies and defamation. The book ends up detailing her relationship with Tiber Septim and her terminated pregnancy. Returning it to her, I was rewarded with gold, reputation, and somewhat useless information. This is where the story continues. The last portion of Daggerfall's journey involves my character getting to level 10. Like I've said previously, level 10 is the final milestone for all of the quests within the main story. As soon as it's reached, it's like opening the floodgates. Everything becomes available and the questline can be completed. So, of course, I was off to Privateer's Hold for my final grind session. I was a ways off from leveling though, and even with my thought out strategic crawl, it took me a couple of laps to get there. I didn't really mind it though. Leveling like this was a great way to get into the flow zone. It was one of the few times in Daggerfall where I felt like I could just shut off my brain and roll through a dungeon. So, in some ways, getting to level 10 was bittersweet. It was sort of like graduating. You're happy to be out of there, but occasionally you reminisce on the good old days. In any case, as soon as I triggered the level up, events were set in motion. Not a couple moments later, a portrait of Medora Dureni appeared on my screen. Then, soon after, a notification popped up. This was Medora attempting to contact me. My vision hazes, the world grows dim, and her face appears right in front of mine. Dureni says, "Bard, your efforts to free me have not been in vain. I have discovered a powder that will soothe the ghost of my beloved Lysandis. However, it is in the hands of Gortwog, warlord of the Orcs, in his steel citadel of Orsinium. Go to him in Orsinium and see if there's anything that could be done to persuade him to give it to you. Bring the powder to me in Dureni Tower once you have it." After that, there's a quirky blurb about how my character wishes she would have just sent a letter. Either way, this is an excellent lead for a quest that's been started many moons ago. Furthermore, it's the official start for wrapping up the Lysandis saga. So, exiting Privateer's Hold, I made way for Orsinium and sought out the King of the Orcs. After defeating his guards, I spoke with Gortwog and he was rather agreeable. The king says that only because he honors and respects the memory of Lysandis, he'll reveal the location of the powder. This dust can be found in the ruins of the old Greenton shack on the Isle of Balfira. Gortwog finishes by saying that Medora owes him. The price of the dust is her support for his claim to the heart, aka the Mantella. Given that Dureni is now an outcast and doesn't really have any remaining ties to any of the kingdoms, I don't think that's a terrible ask. Heading on over to the ruins of the old Greenton shack, what a mouthful, I stepped inside of its dungeon and began the crawl. This one was pretty similar to my quest for Sindasa the Maid. There's no exact location or pathway to get to the quest item. My objective was to roam around the area in search of a particular enemy. A mummy was my target. It apparently had the dust in its inventory, so I was essentially sticking my head into every nook and cranny and taking on every NPC in here. I actually enjoyed the concept of this crawl though. It was refreshing from the usual take this hallway, activate this elevator, pull this lever, swim across this lake type of adventure. Again, I could just sort of shut my mind off and really take the time to explore the dungeon. Compared to some of my previous crawls, I'd say that this run was actually quite short. Maybe around 15 or so minutes into the adventure, I heard my target's unique groan and soon laid eyes on the undead. Defeating it and looting its corpse, it not only had the dust on it, which happened to be lich dust, but it also had a letter. The sender's name was cut off to just Warl, but my best guess was that it was Warlord. Reading it, it says, "This parchment was used as a wrap for the packet of powder. Some of its message is now illegible. Lady Med, favor. They intend to slay him. I am sending Urs to stop them. You must support me. If the Empire finds I have attacked royal advisors away, even if they are assassins, my people will never win the same status and respect as the Khajiit, Ians. However, with your support, I could a hero of the Empire and win respect from my people. Gortwog, Warl." Now, just to fill in the blanks for anyone who might be confused, this letter actually gave me some goosebumps when I read it. I certainly wasn't expecting it, and that's what made it so impactful. Gortwog was allied with Lysandis in hopes of getting the orcs the same sort of citizenship as all the other races. He specifically calls out the Khajiit and the Argonians. Gortwog, just wait until you see what happens in the next game. Either way, the orc raiding party that cut off Wayrest's advisors, the one that Helseth mentioned some time ago, knew that they were assassins heading for Lysandis. While Gortwog's armies got most of the advisors, a handful of them made it through, and the rest is history. Now, I'm curious as to why Gortwog sent this to Medora instead of, say, Minas Tirith. My guess is that maybe the court sorceress had more compassion for orcs than the former queen. Also, in one of Minas Tirith's hidden letters, again from a quest some time ago, it's revealed that her father had slaughtered a whole colony of orcs. So yeah, if you're an Orsimer, probably best to not strike a deal with the Queen Mother. In any case, after escaping the dungeon, it was on to the bane of my playthrough, Durrani Tower. I knew what to expect from it already. I've crawled through it a handful of times now. I won't go over the details again as you probably get the picture. However, this time around I did manage to slay the Lich instead of just running past it. At level 10, that should be the bare minimum requirement, so it really isn't anything to brag about, but just thought I'd share. In any case, chatting with Durrani, she confirmed that this powder was the dust of restful death, and that the letter from Gortwog was intended for her. However, she never received it, a bit of an ongoing theme in this game. Medora vouches for the orcs and says that they're not the villains that most people assume them to be. She then touches on Wayrest and King Aedwir. Everyone knows that he's never been a fan of the Empire, but to go to the lengths of assassinating another king, that's too far, and Durrani would like to get to the bottom of it. Before sending me off, the sorceress says to check in with her in 1 month's time. That's when the dust will be ready, and she can then give me my next quest. I really didn't want to leave the tower, as that would have meant running through the whole gauntlet again, but I also didn't have the patience to wait here for 30 days. Fortunately, my next return to the tower would be my final one, so there was some light at the end of the tunnel. In the meantime, I figured the best way to kill 30 days was to travel around. Because I was traveling around, I figured I'd do some housekeeping, banking, shopping, and resting. Well, not long ago, I lucked out with my mithril daikatana. I would not have the same fortune looking for an adamantium version. I've come across and have other types of adamantium weapons, but in order to use my build to its full potential, the daikatana was my goal. In any case, when ready, I took a deep breath and ran back through Durrani Tower. For this one, there was no messenger or vision telling me that the dust was ready. After 30 days, it's on the player to return to Medora. Luckily, there's no time limit for this one, or else most players probably would have gotten hacked at the knees here. Now, I mentioned it before, but I didn't know it at the time, this was the last time I would have had to crawl through Durrani Tower. Unlike Privateer's Hold, this one was not bittersweet, it was just sweet. Soon, I reached Medora and interacted with her. She told me that, surprise surprise, the powder was ready. All I had to do was sprinkle it on Lysandis' corpse. She warns me though that this sole act won't put his spirit to rest, it only soothes it long enough for me to speak with him. Lysandis will have to be the one who picks his final exorcism. Durrani then follows that up with how she doesn't know where the king was buried, so I'll be on my own for that one. She ends our conversation by asking if I could send him her love and that soon death won't be a barrier for them anymore. Maybe because she's a sorceress and possibly even an ousted necromancer, she can talk with spirits beyond the veil, but who knows. Also, I know that she was Lysandis' preferred lover, but still it feels a little odd to be leaning into the whole affair, especially after all that's transpired. In any case, lucky for me, because I helped the Underking a couple of quests ago, I know exactly where Lysandis was buried. In the region of Menevia, there's literally a dungeon called Lysandis' tomb. Traveling over, I began my crawl through the late king's final resting spot, or rather, his intended resting spot. Now, in terms of distance traveled, Lysandis' tomb was a fairly long journey. There were a ton of winding corridors, confusing intersections, and meandering hallways. There were plenty of staircases that rose and fell, and there were enemies lurking behind every corner. However, in terms of enemies, I expected them to be a little more challenging, especially for a late game dungeon. I faced off against skeletons, spiders, nuisance creatures, and zombies. According to several third-party sources, there were supposed to be wraiths, vampires, vampire ancients, and liches here. I never ended up encountering any of those though. I'm unsure if this dungeon maybe has random spawn types and I just got lucky, or if maybe Unity had something to do with that. This wouldn't be the last time I encountered a dumbed down dungeon either, as you'll soon come to see. Either way, taking the softball and hitting a home run, I navigated my way through the crypt until finally I hit a rather large and unique room. This felt like a crypt for kings, and after discovering a secret passageway leading further down, I'd soon land on Lysandis' coffin. After taking out these skeletal guards, I approached the slab of stone and sprinkled the dust of restful death on Lysandis' corpse.
You soothe my rage. I do not seek to be placated. I seek vengeance upon he who slew me. If you would truly lay my spirit to rest, be the instrument of my vengeance against Lord Woodborn of Wayrest.
Hearing Lysandis' dialogue for a second time, it's certainly a lot clearer. However, if you're like me and just couldn't quite catch the details the first time round, basically he says that he wants revenge on Lord Woodborn of Wayrest, Lysandis' true assassin. Well, the plot continues to thicken. Isn't Lord Woodborn the man who allegedly possesses the totem of Tiber Septim? How convenient that he's the one who slew the king then, and I can only wonder if there's any connection there. Either way, this puts an end to the quest, and from here, I'm free to leave the tomb. Now, this next quest might be up there as one of my favorites for Daggerfall. There are so many different outcomes and possibilities, and depending on what I choose here, it could have an impact on the game's ending. For starters, the first thing I have to do is obviously go and confront Lord Woodborn. Woodborn resides at Woodborn Hall in Wayrest. This dungeon was actually even easier than the last, and while I wouldn't say Lysandis' tomb was a walk in the park, it certainly wasn't difficult. I'd say that the hall was more of a straightforward crawl, while the tomb had slightly easier enemies in it. After solving a small puzzle in the first section of the trek, the rest was simple enough. In terms of enemies, I fought mostly against humans, orcs, and centaurs. There were some undead sprinkled in there too, but not very many. Honestly, there came a point in Daggerfall where the rogues and spellcasters got a little tricky to fight against. They were able to deal incredible amounts of damage to my character, and they themselves took extra hits to defeat. Sometimes, if overwhelmed, they'd be able to beat me in combat, so I had to be extra cautious in here. Either way, eventually I hit a path of no return in Woodborn Hall. This is where the quest branches out. There are two ways to get revenge for Lysandis. The first way is to directly confront Lord Woodborn, and that led me to taking a certain route through the dungeon. Heading north at a particular intersection brought me to Woodborn's ends. Poking my head into each room, the Lord ended up finding me first and got a surprise attack off. Retaliating, this brought on some dialogue from Woodborn. He says, You're that Redguard bard. You have been a thorn in my side for a long time now. A wiser Redguard would have let sleeping kings lie, especially when I have gone to such great lengths to kill them. Yes, bard, I killed King Lysandis, and now it will be a pleasure to slay you, on guard. With the quote, boss fight, comes a full-on confession, not that I really needed it though. Woodborn isn't a difficult opponent, and apparently just has the same stats as any old knight. With his death, Woodbourne lets out yet another confession, and this one links some of the missing pieces together. With his grasps for life and fainted breath, he calls upon King Gothred, the son of King Lysandis and the current ruler of Daggerfall, to finish their work. Woodbourne says that he's going to hell and that he hopes to see me down there. This acts as another confession of sorts. He knows what he did was wrong and that there was no redeeming act in assassinating Lysandis.
King Lysandis is at last able to rest. The wraiths and ghosts of his loyal soldiers vanish as the soul passes to the underworld, leaving the city of Daggerfall to the living.
With that, Lysandis has been avenged and his spirit is now at rest. That officially puts an end to half of Daggerfall's story. Leaving Woodbourne Hall, my work here is done, and the only thing I can do now is wait for the next quest, the two-part finale for Daggerfall's main questline. However, like I said earlier, there are two branches for this quest, and in fact, choosing to go through the other pathway creates several other branches for completing this mission, but I'll get into those in just a bit. So reverting back, this time I went east at the junction and followed the hallways. For this outcome, I don't actually get to fight with Lord Woodbourne. While his death was satisfying, one can make the argument that this conclusion is even more enjoyable. After fighting through waves of enemies and crawling through more corridors, I finally landed on my point of interest. This little side room holds Lord Woodbourne's diary. It isn't long or extensive, but it's practically a tell-all into Lysandis' death, as it connects all the pieces together. The journal reads, Page 7, From childhood, I know that Gothred would not refuse his aid, but I must bide my time to ask. After all, Elisana is still heiress of Wayrest, and I am her betrothed. So, it should be that when Aedwyr dies, which she is bound to do so, sooner rather than later, I will be king. If it weren't for that bitch queen and her brats, I would and could be patient. Never trust a dark elf, the old saying goes, for you cannot read truth in their eyes. If Baranzaya has her way, Helsith will be heir and Elisana will be married off to some far-off kingdom. Morgaya is already promised to the heir of Firsthold, but they keep her around to spread the poison against Elisana and especially me. Baranzaya doesn't trust me. This I can tell. I will deal with her just as I did with Lysandis. The fool should have agreed to support me. Gortwog and his orcs almost saved him. I'll deal with those subhumans once I sit upon the throne of Wayrest. First, it is important to solidify my power base. I can, almost certainly, rely on Gothred to support my bid for the throne, if Helsith is made heir. I have a spy network equaling Aedwyr, Gothred, Akarithi, or the Emperor. Perhaps the Necromancers and the Underking's networks are more extensive, but I doubt it. The problem is raw physical power. I do not have a standing army. I need the gold to raise. Alright, so there's a good bit to unpack here. Number one, obviously, as we had just learned, Gothred is working with Lord Woodbourne. However, it's never explicitly stated if Gothred was complicit with his father's murder. In fact, there are debates about this online, and while concrete evidence has never been found, there is a prevailing side to this argument, which will be revealed later. Alright, number two, Elisana is betrothed to Lord Woodbourne. This means that Lord Woodbourne was the man in the grey cloak who set me up while escorting Elisana's fake cousin to that village. He's also the one who likely sent me all of those threatening letters, and considering he's a lord, it makes sense that he had all of that manpower. Just how complicit Elisana was with Woodbourne's plans are unknown. Maybe she was just a puppet, or possibly she was pulling the strings. It's hard to tell, but my guess is that she was practically all in on it. Number 3 has already been confirmed, but Lysandis was teamed up with the Orcs and Gortwog, who are steadily becoming my favorite faction. Number 4, it doesn't appear as though Baranzaya, Helsith, Morgaya, or anyone else in the court were in on Lysandis' assassination. It sounds like it was more secretive than what I had initially thought. This is also brought on by Woodbourne's talks of usurping the throne of Wayrest. Now, I'm pretty sure that Aedwyr is absolved in all of this, but if Woodbourne's plans get set in motion, he does stand to gain from it by having Elisana be crowned queen. Either way, for now, I'm leaning more towards him not playing a role in Lysandis' death. Then lastly, number 5, my guess is that with the way his entry ended off, instead of raising an army, Woodbourne attempted to gain control of Numidium. With the totem of Tiber Septim, the Mantella, and the Brass God, he could easily crush anyone who defied him. Well, he found one of those things, and it looks like he was getting close to finding the others. In any case, now it's on to the important decision. With Woodbourne's journal, I now have to decide who I want to hand it off to. Which ruling faction or important character gets to hear Woodbourne's tell-all first? I have to pick very wisely though, as some NPCs have pretty harsh reactions to it. Some characters end up having the same reactions as others though, so with those ones I'll jumble them all together. First up, there's Minnesera, Nilfgaard, and Medora. All three women react the same way to the letter. They say, Lord Woodbourne is the slayer of my dear Lysandis. There shall be justice, and it shall come from my hand. You would do best to stay clear of Woodbourne Hall and Wayrest for some time, Bard. Next, there's the Kingdom of Wayrest. Aedwir, Baranzaya, and Helseth all respond with the same message. This is atrocious. After all the affection we showered on that fool Woodbourne, we nearly married that villainous swine to Elisana, nearly handed the throne of Wayrest to a cad of the First Order. Good Bard, it was the right thing to do to bring this to our attention. Rest assured that Lord Woodbourne will be arrested and executed for his treason, his name barred from the books of honor, his acquaintances interrogated, his fortune confiscated. As a gift, please allow me to give you 18,480 gold pieces as your share of his property confiscations. That's certainly nothing to scoff at, and if you ask me, that's a worse punishment for Woodbourne than a swift death in battle. This is also where I started to doubt Aedwir's involvement in Lysandis' death, as well as Elisana's exact role in everything. Of course, Aedwir could just be playing everything up, but still, his response seems somewhat genuine. As for Elisana, well, there's no closure for her part in everything, so we never get a straight answer unfortunately. At this point, in order to progress with the questline and to put Lysandis' spirit to rest, these are the NPCs who you should be handing the journal off to. They're the ones who trigger Lysandis' cutscene, as otherwise, going forward, anyone else will not do the trick. With that being said, up next, there are the mutual factions. Both Gortwog and the King of Worms react to the journal in a rather lackluster sort of way. They say, this information is quite valuable. Let me gift you with 894 gold for giving it to me. This will be quite handy in the coming conflict. Worth noting is that the rewarded gold is a random amount. Beyond that, there's not much more that comes from either leader. Then the next slightly less neutral but still uncaring NPC is Queen Aetherius of Sentinel. The queen says, this means little to me. It is trash fit only for being burnt. Gothrid and Woodbourne plotting to kill Lysandis? Really, go away. This is obviously a pretty disappointing outcome, but perhaps even worse is if you give the diary to Gothrid and or Obki. Either NPC will say, you were completely correct to bring this to me. Otherwise, it might have gotten out where it could do Lord Woodbourne damage. Guards, kill this red guard. This is a pretty telling piece of dialogue, at least in my opinion. Gothrid is more concerned with covering up the story than he is the truth, which to me makes it seem like he knew about the plot against his own father. Plus, according to Aetherius, this entry was apparently obvious that Gothrid was involved in his father's murder. So to me, that pretty much puts the nail in the coffin for his guilt. Furthermore, given that Obki says the exact same bit of dialogue as Gothrid, I can only assume that she knows more than she's let on. How much more is hard to say, but I agree with Minnesera. She's not to be trusted. In any case, other than rewards, this outcome brings on an abundance of reputation with whomever you delivered the journal to. In my case, I chose to go with the Kingdom of Wayrest, in particular Baranzaya, mostly because of the gold, but I also like the promises that were made towards ruining Woodbourne's life. Now, reputation ends up playing a pretty large part in how the game ends, so that's important to keep in mind if you wanted to boost your disposition with any of the ruling parties. In any case, once Woodbourne has been defeated or the diary handed off to a faction, this quest comes to a close, and so does Lysandis' chapter for Daggerfall. However, there's still the matter of the second part to the story, the plotline that was initially an afterthought to the king's death, but now has taken all of Daggerfall by storm. After traveling around for a couple of weeks, I was intercepted by a courier. She handed me a letter and then walked off. The letter is from Lady Brysiena, the very same agent who got me started on this whole journey. It reads, Bard, come at once to Charon Ridge Hollow in Wayrest. I will be waiting at the Devil's Skull for you. The fate of the Empire could be at stake. Signed, Lady Brysiena. Its contents are quite ominous, but I'm sure we can all guess what this matter's about. After a small gear dump and deposit to the bank, I made way for the village and sought out the inn. Entering the Devil's Skull, I found Brysiena in the corner and interacted with her. She said that she was glad I could meet her here and said that the Blades, as well as the Emperor, needed my help again. The lady mentions how the totem of Tiber's Septum has been found by Lord Woodbourne, which at this point is old news. However, she then gives an update. Apparently, sometime after my journey through Woodbourne Hall, the Blades launched an attack on it and razed the fortress to the ground. There were a lot of casualties from both sides. However, the totem, the Blades' sole reason for going there, was nowhere to be found. Brysiana believes that King Gothred of Daggerfall now has it, as obviously he was in cahoots with Woodbourne. The Blades no longer have the manpower to launch any kind of assaults, especially on Castle Daggerfall. So Brysiana asks me if I'd be willing to brave its dungeons in order to retrieve the totem of Tiber Septim. Accepting the quest, she informs me that it's likely in Daggerfall's treasury, a unique room that's hard to miss. As for her, she needs to leave again, but apparently Brysiana will send a letter to me once I'm successful. If I hand the totem over to the Empire, I'll be rewarded with an incredibly powerful artifact, the Warlock's Ring. This coming crawl will be the second last one of Daggerfall's main story. It's surprisingly not that complicated or long of a journey though. Really, its claim to fame, at least in my opinion, is the treasury, and you'll see why. For starters, there was the matter of getting into the dungeons. Similarly to entering Castle Wayrest, I had to use force and bust down one of the doors. This obviously caught the attention of the nearby guards, and let's just say that they wouldn't let me go in there without a fight. After a couple of attempts at getting through that door, I finally cleared the local resistance and had begun my adventure. The enemies in Castle Daggerfall's dungeon were identical to those in Woodbourne Hall. It largely consisted of humans, and then sprinkled in there were centaurs and orcs. While the treasury was the real gem of this expedition, there was one other notable area. A large open room that contains several towers. It's similar to rooms that I've seen before in other dungeons, like Castle Fulham and even Dereni Tower. After paving a path through Daggerfall's soldiers and exploring a bit more of the dungeon, I finally landed on the treasury. This chamber was massive. Perhaps not as big as the previous room, but its layout was most certainly unique. It was a giant square with walkways leading all around the edges. They spiraled downwards, and perched on each landing was either an archer or a knight. At its center was a huge floating cube that contained several blocked off little cubicles. As it would turn out, the totem was in one of those, but first I had to go through the motions. For starters, I had to clear a path down. This took me longer than I thought it would have. The mages and rogues down here had it locked down tight and made it very difficult to gain access to the lower part of the dungeon. Funnily enough, for the treasury, I think fending off these three enemies was the part that took me the longest, which is kind of embarrassing to say. Either way, when the coast was clear, I hopped down to the lowest section of the treasury and began my job of lowering the cube. Fortunately, it wasn't that difficult to do. I swam through a flooded section, took on an ice atronach, and landed at a wheel. Turning it, this was all it took to lower the cube, which was fantastic. However, I was now trapped underneath it, as my exit was sealed off. Luckily, one of the side rooms had some magical chains dangling from the wall. Activating the middle one, I ended up getting teleported out from under the cube and over to the tallest point of the treasury. From here, I leapt over to a lever that was on top of the cube. Pulling it, it opened up a couple of the cubicles, and one of them was the room that held the totem. While fighting off some of the aforementioned archers and guards, I cased the chambers and spotted my mark. Leaping into said room, I laid eyes on the totem of Tiber Septim, which honestly looked kind of creepy. It almost looked like a doll that was wrapped in cloth. Maybe it literally was a totem of Tiber Septim. Either way, picking it up, my job here was finished, but not so fast. Moments later, a notification popped up. The totem itself began speaking to me. I heard a voice inside my head, and it said, "You are Bard. You are my new host. Know this now and resolutely. You are not worthy to carry the totem of Tiber Septim. Only those of his bloodline may carry me. I will give you a year and a day to accomplish this." Essentially, this is the game's way of saying that I cannot keep or use the totem for myself. It must be handed over to someone else, and that has to be done in a timely manner. At this point, I'm free to leave the dungeon and have to make a hasty getaway from the castle's courtroom guards. So this is the part in Daggerfall where I get to see the fruits of my labor. Everyone now knows that I possess the totem, and because of that, they're all vying for my attention. Some through good means and others through bad ones. Opting for a good night's rest at one of the local inns, I rented a room and attempted to get some shut-eye. However, very shortly into my rest, I was interrupted by some nearby enemies. A trio of orc warlords had made their way into the tavern and sought me out. They began attacking on sight, and when I retaliated, they relayed a message from Gortwog. The king of the orcs said that I must die. The warlords get to keep all of my goods except for the totem. That gets handed to Gortwog. Going forward, every time I wait or rest, there's a chance that I'll be attacked by a band of orcs. However, that's not all. Humans ended up attacking me as well. They were apparently sent by Queen Aetherius of Sentinel. She too is after the totem, and the assassins say that I should have tried harder to get on her good side. So, This is what leads me back to the whole reputation thing. At this point in Daggerfall's main story, there's no more getting on anyone's good side or bad side. Whatever their thoughts are on me, that's it. Unfortunately, I guess I didn't do a good enough job with Gortwog, which is a shame as I was starting to like him in the orcs. On the other hand, I really could not care less for Akarithi or Sentinel as a whole, so to me, not a big loss there. Now, King Gothrid also sends his soldiers after me, and in fact, it's sort of muddled as to which faction the trio of soldiers belongs to. I'd assume if they don't mention anything about Akarithi, they've come from Daggerfall. I guess no matter what, because I stole the totem from Gothrid, he's rather merciless in getting it back. Now, here's the good side of the quest. Every faction and NPC that I've helped along the way ends up sending me a letter. Essentially, they all explain why they'd make for the best candidate to receive the totem. I ended up getting letters from Lady Briscienna, the King of Worms, the Underking, and King Aedweir. Starting with Briscienna's, hers reads, Bard, if you are reading this, you must have gotten the totem and escaped from the dungeons of Castle Daggerfall. I am in Garston Palace of Wayrest at the Buckington residence. Bring the totem there as soon as possible. Signed, Lady Briscienna. The next one is from the Underking, and it reads, Bard, centuries ago, Tiber Septim ruled the land and forged an empire with Great Numidium. The secret of Numidium's power lies in its heart, carried within the Mantella. It is the heart of Tiber Septim's battle mage. It is my heart, it is my Mantella, it is my totem. It belongs to me and to none other. I have won and lost an empire. I have no desire to tamper further with mortal affairs. I have in my possession Necromancer's Amulet, one of the world's greatest artifacts. You may have it in exchange for the totem. My most loyal agent will await your arrival in Eternal Prophet of Akatosh of Wayrest at the order of the hour. Signed, Underking. The next letter comes from the King of Worms, and it reads, Bard, you will soon have the totem of Tiber Septim in your hands. It is foreseen in the stars, and I have read them. Know you this, all of mortal stature are filled with pride and greed. To give the totem to any of them is to let loose mortal vanity upon this world. They will destroy the very thing they covet. I have no earthly desires, I have no mortal pride, no petty greed. Only one such as I can wield the totem safely, for I would take it into Aetherius and leave behind this earthly shell. So long as the totem exists, it is a danger to all on Tamriel. Bring me the totem and I will safeguard the world. I will not offer you gold or gems. I will offer you only what I can give, fame. Your reputation throughout Tamriel will soar. Lord of the Necromancers, King of the Worms. Then the final letter is from King Aedweir. It reads, Noble Bard, my ears have picked up rumors that you are searching for the totem of Tiber Septim. I too have hunted for this wondrous artifact for many years. Should you find it, I would pay you a healthy ransom, enough to buy your own ship. I will match or exceed any price that Gothrid or Akarithi might offer. Never forget your real friends. Signed, King Aedweir of Wayrest. Now it's decision time. Who do I give the totem to? Well, I thought long and hard on this one. Who deserves it the most, and who do I actually like? Right off the bat, I was a no on King Aedweir. I still don't really trust him, and I don't think he's that strong of a candidate here. While I like the King of Worms, mostly out of fear, I don't think he's that deserving of the totem, at least no more than the remaining two players. Now, for those who don't know how the game ends, don't worry, I'm going to get into the King of Worms later, but for now, forget I said anything. So, that leads Lady Briscienna, who will give it to Uriel Septim, and the Underking, aka Zurin Arctis. Uriel is the current owner of Numidium. He's my original quest giver and theoretical boss, as well as someone who can possibly be trusted with this great power. On the other hand, the Mantella literally belongs to Zurin Arctis. It's his life force. He also promised that he wouldn't use the totem to meddle in the affairs of mortals, a promise that wasn't necessarily made by Uriel. So in the end, I decided to meet the Underking's loyal servant in the Order of the Hour and Eternal Prophet of Akatosh. The agent said that Zurin will be most pleased and that he spent a long time looking for this artifact. Holding up his end of the bargain, the servant hands me the Necromancer's Amulet and finishes off by saying that should I ever locate the Mantella, the Underking would be most appreciative. Well, right after I back out of this interaction, another notification pops up. It says that the unmistakable voice of Nofalga begins to speak in my head. She says, I see that the totem has found its way into the hands of someone with royal blood. I think it is time you paid me another visit here in Shedungeon, Bard. Your work is not yet done. Suddenly, the old witch that everyone discounted sounds very sane and very important. Funny how that works. By heading to Nilfgaard, I'll embark on the final quest for Daggerfall's main story. Now, before doing so, I wanted to just see what it would have been like if I handed the totem to the other 3 parties. The first one I started with was King Aetherius, and let me tell you, this guy sucks. He calls me a fool, asks if I really thought he'd pay me for the totem, and then orders the courtroom guards to kill me. The totem stays with Aetherius, and I'm forced to complete the final quest with it in his possession. It was literally because of Aetherius' dialogue that I went back and forth on him being part of Woodbourne's plans. But considering that the totem is a separate plotline from the assassination, I don't know if I can actually draw any parallels there. The next person I tried was the King of Worms. He seemed ecstatic to have it in his possession and thanked me for bringing it to him. He says that he'll remember this when he, quote, transforms, whatever that means. As his dialogue closes out, he tells me to now search for the mantella, as otherwise the totem is useless without it. Then the final recipient is Lady Brisena. Handing it to her, she thanks me for finding it and says that if it were to end up in the hands of the wrong person, surely it would have started a civil war. Brisena then sends me off to Nilfgaard, as she apparently holds the key to the mantella. I'm to free the mantella, and then the Emperor can control Numidium via the totem. How Brisena knew this information is beyond me. However, given that Lysandis was close with the Emperor, I'm sure that Nilfgaard could have been in the same boat, and that maybe these were secrets shared amongst close friends. Alright, now with everything out of the way and with the totem in the Underking's possession, it was time to visit Nilfgaard and Shedudgend. Important to note, for this final quest and the last crawl for Daggerfall's main story, this is the point of no return. Speaking with Nilfgaard sets up a series of events that can't be undone. Now is the time to repair gear, buy potions, dump gold, get some good rest, cure afflictions, so on and so forth. Arriving at Shedudgend, the usual human bodyguards were now ice atronachs, which to me symbolized a great change in the game's atmosphere. Ascending the court steps, I laid eyes on Queen Grandmother Nilfgaard. Taking a deep breath, I approached the Cirrus and with the press of a button, initiated her dialogue. All of a sudden, Nilfgaard's dialogue wasn't muddled and crazy sounding. She was normal now and even used some complex riddles. Nilfgaard ended up saying, "Only crowned heads will hold the totem true. First is one who killed, but did not kill another. Second is one who is too devoured by its young. Third is one who made one slave and many free. Fourth and fifth are two who compete for mud. Sixth is one who brings a home to the homeless. Seventh is one who lords all, but does not lord at all. I do not know who of these 7 is most worthy of the power. For too long have I let my passions make me mad. Sometimes the fate of a world hang on the decision of one person. You have chosen who will command Great Numidium. You bear the burden for the consequences. I send you now to the Mantellan Crux, the safeguarded prison of the Mantella. Look for a green jewel of unusual size. Merely touch the mantella and it is freed. You will be transported back to my side." Exiting the dialogue screen, the game pauses momentarily and then all of a sudden I'm transported to Aetherius. This was by far the longest, most difficult dungeon that I've run through in the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall. It is complicated, complex, frustrating, and challenging, not only with its puzzles and traps, but also with the enemies that were here. Essentially, the toughest opponents that Daggerfall can throw at me were thrown at me. Vampire Ancients, Dark Seducers, Daedra Lords, which are a new one, Liches, Atronachs, and Gargoyles. This was a real doozy, and it took me even longer than my Castle Fallen run to complete, which is probably how it should have been anyways. Because of all these factors, and because almost every single third-party resource does it too, I'm going to break down the crawl section by section. The first one was the Floating Islands. This area was extremely dark and relatively barren. There were a handful of floating islands, some big, some small, and each contained a piece of the puzzle when it came to moving on from here. There were a couple of enemies that lurked in the dark, but for the most part, there weren't nearly as many as the preceding areas. Using levitation as well as a series of elevators, I had to activate certain contraptions while leaving other ones alone. This involved hopping across the islands as well as wandering through some out-of-place corridors. The goal was to gain access to a barred-off area, an area that contained a Daedra Lord, one of the most powerful enemies in the game. Inside his chamber, there was a small red carpet, and stepping onto it, I was instantly teleported to the next zone of the dungeon, the pyramid. In my opinion, the pyramid was the trickiest part of this crawl. The enemies were really powerful, and it got me thinking that maybe I should have come a little more prepared. At the center of this area was, surprise surprise, a great pyramid. It was guarded over by an ancient lich, which, trust me, is not an easy opponent. Luckily, I don't really need to fight it. In fact, one of Daggerfall's charms is that you technically don't need to fight very many enemies, as most you could just run past. Anyways, taking a series of lifts and elevators in this zone, I'm brought to a small graveyard section. It houses 2 regular vampires and 1 vampire ancient. 2v1 I'm already struggling, but a 3v1 on a small platform, I don't know about that one. Either way, the platform has a handful of tombstones, and interacting with 3 of them is a part of this area's puzzle. The white tombstone is simple, and it displays a message saying, "Here lies the spirit of Benefactor," though his body still guards the way. The other 2 tombstones open up a trapdoor within the pyramid, the entire goal for this area, and lower a force field that's directly below the graveyard. From here, there are several other contraptions that need to be interacted with in order to open the rest of the pyramid's trapdoors. As for the white gravestone's message, in one of the side areas for this zone, there's a friendly NPC who poses the riddle: "I guard the way, speak only my name, and I shall grant you passage." As we now know, his name is Benefactor, and typing that in, it opens up the outer entrance to the pyramid. From here, I was free to make my way down the pyramid and into the next zone of Aetherius, the Overturned Shrine. This was probably the smallest and easiest area of the crawl. There weren't any enemies here, and it sort of acted like a simple platformer. All I had to do was access a few of the shrine's rooms and pull their corresponding levers. Doing so, it revealed a large crystal in the southern chamber, and interacting with it sent me to the next zone, the fire room. Technically, the exact room shows up in a bit, but first I needed to go through the correct doorway. Some of them have enemies behind them, others inflict damage on my character, and one even trapped me in a cage. Soon though, I found the correct path and was brought to the room with fire. This is one of the most unique spaces of Aetherius, and for good reason. You'll soon see why. The bottom level contained fire Deja, while the elevated walkways had fire Atronachs. Above the walkways were these awkward-looking floating skulls. Passing underneath the first one, it began speaking to me. It said, "Hear me, the blind god is a jealous god. Let his true servants lift up their eyes unto him, and the way will be easy. Hear me." So at first, this was confusing. I saw that the skull I had walked under started to rotate. Then I discovered that by interacting with the other skulls on the walkway, they rotate as well. However, some are nefarious and some are red herrings. One of them tries to paralyze me, and another drops me from the top of the room. Some of them grant temporary buffs, and some don't do anything. However, 3 of them are needed to lower the force fields that are blocking the blind god's eyes. When those have been properly activated, the force field lowers. Now, interestingly, you never guess who makes an appearance here. Standing in the blind god's right eye is the Daedric Prince of Madness, Sheogorath. Interacting with him, he says, "At last. I was beginning to think you wouldn't get this far. A dreary place, don't you agree? And guarded by a pompous upstart. He's no more a god than I am. Well, carry on. We will meet again soon, unless you are not as foolhardy as you appear." Why is Sheogorath overseeing my journey through Aetherius? I really have no clue. Honestly though, my best guess is that it has to do with Nulfaga. Considering she was clinically insane up until this point in the story, I'd wager that the Prince of Madness had something to do with it. Either way, the final bit for the fire room is a riddle that comes directly from the blind god, a canon entity that rivals the Daedric princes in power, yet we never hear from again in the elderscrolls. It says, "One speaks for me, 2 serve me. 6 protect me, how many defy me?" In order to answer this one, you had to have been somewhat observant. The riddle is referring to the other skulls in the room, and only one of them was an outlier, as it was facing away from the blind god. Typing in 1, I'm teleported to the next zone of the dungeon, Sheogorath's crossbow, as others have coined it. As of the moment, I'm trapped inside a small room that has 9 skulls lining its walls. Pressing on them, they have different effects. Some inflict damage, others drop me from tall places, and one of them opens the door to the room. This section of the crawl is like a beat-em-up. Flesh and iron Atronachs were waiting for me at every turn. Luckily though, they weren't difficult foes and could be taken out rather easily. After running through that small gauntlet, I was brought to a separate area that eventually teleported me to an open area of Aetherius. I was now on a small island with a giant sword sticking out of its center. Surrounding me were a whole bunch of trapped Daedra lords. Apparently, they were supposed to be bringing hell down on me with their spells and magic, but I suppose I lucked out. In between 2 of the lords, there was a small platform, and jumping on it, I was teleported to Sheogorath's domain. A message pops up on my screen and says, "So Bard, Come to pay your respects properly at last? This small enclosed area ends up leading me to Sheogorath's chambers. When interacted with, the Daedric Prince welcomed me and posed a question. He said, "Greetings, Bard. You dare much by intruding here. Nevertheless, I will allow you to proceed, provided you prove as perceptive as rumors report. You may be aware that I am a master of the blade, but what is my other favorite weapon? Answer correctly, then arm yourself." Well, there's a reason this area is known as Sheogorath's crossbow, as if you were to zoom out on the map, you'd see that it's in the shape of one. So typing that in, the message disappears and the crawl continues. Backtracking through the enclosed area, there's a small pit that holds yet another teleporter. This leads me back to the Sword Island. However, now that I've answered the question correctly, a trapdoor opens up and reveals more interactive objects. By pressing them in the correct order, the island begins to slowly descend. If the Daedra Lords were meaner, they'd surely be taking potshots at me. Eventually, Giant Sword Island reaches Giant Crossbow Island. Hopping over to it and pressing on the mechanism, it teleports me back up to the sword. Now in a dodgeball-like manner, I have to run across the blade, avoiding all sorts of spells and attacks from the Trapped Lords. Making it to the other side in one piece, I had a huge sigh of relief. Now, it is with great pleasure that I get to say, from this point forward, it's officially the cool-off section of Aetherius. This is the room zone. It essentially has a whole bunch of small side rooms that I need to navigate through. They contain some powerful enemies, but nothing compared to what I've already gone through. At the end of those, there's a small platforming section that's easy, but if I fall down, I get ganked by a bunch of vampire ancients. Then, after that, there's the literal light at the end of the tunnel. In a gigantic open room, hovering at the center, there's the aforementioned green gem, aka the Mantella. Interacting with the lantern behind me, it grants me with temporary levitation. Floating over to it, there are no barriers, puzzles, obstacles, or enemies. It's straightforward, and it's pure bliss. Grabbing the Mantella, I'm instantly teleported back to Shedungeon. Looking around, wondering what's next, Nilfgaard speaks to me again. She says, "Not so fast, Bard. Don't you want to see the result of your handiwork? Look now into the Book of Time. Read upon its pages the history of what shall pass within the next few days. Read fate as it shall be recorded upon the elderscrolls."
Centuries of undead sleep are shaken off, rousing the Underking. No mortal force can stop his fateful reunion with the ghost of his heart, and he joins with it in an all-consuming fiery embrace, and for just one moment, he is flesh and blood, then blessed death is granted to Kyberceptive's battle mage.
As the cutscene ends, Nilfgaard speaks one more time. She tells me that my work here is done. The world has been forever changed, but that's the way it's always been. Events shaped Tamriel, and they alter its history in ways that not many can understand. Nilfgaard's dialogue closes out, and with that, the entire main story of the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall comes to an end. Alright, now that the game is over, let's go over a little bit of housekeeping. The Underking, the ruler that I had handed the totem off to, kept his word. He used the Mantella to bring himself death, and to me, that's one of the best endings for Daggerfall. Now, for curiosity's sake, let's talk about the other possible endings. Unsurprisingly, if I had handed the totem over to any of the kings or queens of the West, they would have used it to raise Numidium and crush their neighboring kingdoms. Gothrid uses it to destroy Sentinel and Wayrest. Aedweir uses it to conquer Sentinel and Daggerfall, and Akarithi uses it to level Daggerfall and Wayrest. Now, surprisingly to some, Gortwog uses it to crush all of the surrounding kingdoms, Wayrest, Daggerfall, and Sentinel, in order to force the Empire to recognize the Orcs as equals. As for Uriel's Septum, even though Brisciana promised that he would safeguard it, he too uses the Mantella to destroy any rebelling nations and shuts down any possible insurrections. Then lastly, there's the King of Worms. He simply uses the Mantella to, quote, leave his mortal frame and join the ranks of the gods of Oblivion. He truly transcended this world, as he said he would, and left the mortal affairs to the mortals. Definitely something to be in awe about. Now, if you were curious about the canon ending of Daggerfall, as surely there can only be one, right? Which one could it be? Well, the answer is all of them. Activating the Mantella ends up creating something that's known as the Warp in the West, or the Dragon Break. Essentially, the TLDR is that Numidium's almost divine-like power has broken the space-time continuum and allowed all of these endings to happen simultaneously. Multiple timelines were spawned from this one event, but they all end up merging back into one. All of the kingdoms maintained their dominance, and Orsinium became recognized as a part of the Empire. The Underking received his death, and the King of Worms achieved godhood. Honestly, while it's really neat, it's also very confusing and very complex. I sort of agree with a lot of the other fans. This feels like it's Bethesda's way of saying, we don't know where the series is going, so to make our lives and storytelling abilities easier, all of the endings are canon and real. Either way, the Warp in the West is an integral part of the Elder Scrolls lore, and it's pretty beloved amongst the fans, so I won't harp on it too much. At this point in the game, none of the major players from the story have anything meaningful to say to the player. Some have basic dialogue menus, others offer petty miscellaneous quests, and the King of Worms just kind of laughs in my face. This truly symbolizes that the story is over, but other adventures await. Alright, with all of that out of the way, here are my final thoughts on the game. I actually really liked the way the story was structured. I grew to enjoy the murder mystery quests, and absolutely adored how they were steeped in conspiracy and curiosity. It was arguably one of the most rewarding stories in the Elder Scrolls, as every time I had completed a quest, I'd learn valuable information that could be used to piece the whole story together. The events weren't told linearly, and I think that's fine for how the storyline was presented. To compare it to, say, Arena, its predecessor, Bethesda did a great job at keeping its basic dungeon crawling mechanics while throwing in more meaningful content to build Daggerfall's story. It wasn't just dungeon after dungeon, there were courier missions, bounty quests, and of course fetch quests. These really helped keep the gameplay and questline fresh and interesting. In my eyes, Daggerfall is the home run sequel that Bethesda needed to put out in order to lift the Elder Scrolls up. Now, comparing the game to its successor, Morrowind, Bethesda went even further and fine-tuned a lot of things that needed work in Daggerfall. For example, by picking the island of Vardenfell, you can create a more intentional world. The kingdom of Daggerfall was technically larger, but considering most of it was either empty or just cookie-cutter dungeons and cities, would you really consider it a bigger and more fulfilling map? While I'm all for in-depth character creation and customization, as I truly believe that it got lost a little in Skyrim, Bethesda cutting out the background questionnaire in Morrowind is a choice that I personally liked. This was presumably done in favor of adding the star signs. Either way, instead of going into the world and establishing your own character's reputations, skills, alignments, and items, and special abilities, Daggerfall confusingly does it for you, or at least it gives you a head start. I personally like the idea of building my character from the ground up, and don't really want them already established in the game's universe. These are just a few examples, and by no means is Daggerfall perfect, but it's not bad either. It really is just a product of its time, which, mind you, this game came out in 1996. It's because of that, and the fact that it's the second game in the series, that I won't be harsh with it or nitpick every little thing. Again, I have to say that personally, Unity 100% changed my Daggerfall experience. While I believe it was for the better, some people may prefer the original game. While Unity maintains the integral part of Daggerfall, it does end up changing a lot in the process and can feel like a different game at times. Before signing off, here are some quick fire thoughts. While Oblivion is my child that can do no wrong, they absolutely butchered Mannimarco / the King of Worms' character in that one. The stoic, mysterious, all-powerful necromancer / lich that turned into a god in Daggerfall is now just some high elf who lives in a cave. While the game calls the last quest Journey to Aetherius, it seems like we were sent to Sheogorath's realm of the Shivering Isles, or at least some other pocket dimension that he rules over. He seemed to have a lot of power in that last dungeon, looked like he was controlling the show, and there was a plethora of Daedra that resided in this outer space area. Plus, combine that with Nulfaga's insanity and the Mantella residing there, it seems like this was a Daedric realm before Bethesda knew what a Daedric realm was. I was really hoping that there would have been some sort of comeuppance for everyone who had wrongdoings in the game. Gothrid, Elisana, Obki, Akarithi, etc. The big players who tried to have my character killed or who killed other characters. I suppose that with the Warp in the West, everyone technically did get what was coming to them, and at the same time, depending on who the players aligned with, it changes their perspective on the story. But still, with Woodbourne's journal out in the open, I was hoping that at least Gothrid would be exiled or something of the sorts. I wholeheartedly believed this whole time that the Underking was evil. I had read about his lore and heard stories in the later games. I assumed that he was just the antagonist of Daggerfall, but that wasn't the case at all. In fact, really the only canonical antagonists are Gothard and Woodbourne, which is interesting to think about. Then lastly, a really cool theory I read online regarding Numidium and the Warp in the West is that that's exactly how Tiber Septim conquered Tamriel. He used its time warping abilities to conquer every single province at the same time. Then, once the timeline was fixed/merged back together, the continent of Tamriel was united as one. Interesting to think about. Thank you everyone for coming along this journey with me. Let me know your thoughts on Daggerfall's main story down below, and until next time, keep on adventuring.